It's long been known that far-right groups seek out the energy of youth to push their movement forward. An important aspect of the Nazis' initial rise, of course, was the Hitler Youth, which served to brainwash and engage a new generation of Nazis. But we don't have to look all the way back to the 1920s and 30s for examples. There's a wealth of literature on the topic of the far-right's appeal to youth, particularly when considering the use of music like National Socialist black metal and rock against communism. In the digital age, however, this conversation simply has to be centered around online cultures, and particularly meme culture. It's easy to dismiss memes as silly internet humor, but the fact of the matter is, memes are a political pamphlet of the 21st century. A single meme can contain layers upon layers of meaning, hidden behind even more layers of humor, inside jokes, cultural references, and irony. My name is Etienne Quintal. I'm an online hate researcher at the Neuberger Holocaust Education Center, and my presentation today, titled Canada First is Inevitable, aims to shed light on the practices of far-right groups in their attempts at reaching today's youth by focusing on propaganda found on TikTok. Before I go on with my presentation, allow me to talk a little bit about the Neuberger Holocaust Education Center, soon to be renamed the Toronto Holocaust Museum, as well as the online hate research and education project I'm currently working on. The Neuberger is a forward-facing museum which seeks to both educate people, particularly students, about the Holocaust, but also foster conversations about ongoing contemporary issues. OREP, the project that I'm working on, very much fits that second objective. OREP is a deep dive into hateful online subcultures, with the aim to both create a database of hateful memes for researchers to sparse through, as well as more public-facing deliverables to increase public knowledge of online hate practices. For example, we'll soon be launching a teaser for a database of symbols that are used by hateful elements in online communications, so stay in the loop for that. Because of COVID-19, our museum facilities have been closed, but will be reopening in 2023 in a brand new location. As well, before we get into the meat of my research, we should probably start with a little bit of background in order to situate ourselves properly. At the onset of the pandemic, when we first started hunkering down and bracing ourselves for impact, many of us turned to social media for comfort and entertainment. I'm not teaching anyone anything new here. It's about that same time that TikTok blew up and became the fastest growing platform in the world, and for good reasons. TikTok is an extremely addictive platform with algorithms that are designed to drown you in content that you like and content that is extremely bingeable. It's short, it's quick, it's to the point, and before you know it, you've spent 30 minutes mindlessly scrolling through your feed. As they often do, far-right groups and movement understood this early on and took advantage of the influx of new users on TikTok in order to promote their views in a way that hadn't been done yet. And so in April 2020, Nick Fuentes, who's the white supremacist American leader of the Groyper movement, which is a sort of alt-right 2.0, called on his troops to create TikTok accounts and flood the platform with far-right propaganda. His troops heeded the call, and soon enough, Groyper content found its way into the feeds of millions of young people. Fuentes and much of his supporters were ultimately banned, but simply kept creating new accounts. There remains a number of Groyper accounts on TikTok to this day, despite the banishments. Around the same time period, as Fuentes' brand became increasingly popular, imitators across borders started to follow in his footsteps in order to build a following. This is when the Groyper movement went international, and how Canada ended up with its own branch of the movement, which more often than not goes by the name Canada First. Canadian Groypers have made their presence known to Canadians, particularly in the last few months. You'll recall an incident during the last federal election in which an anti-vax protester threw pebbles at the Prime Minister of Canada during a campaign stop in London, Ontario. The individuals involved in this stunt were in fact members of the Groyper movement. Like their American counterparts, Canadian Groypers are keen to flood social media platforms with their content, creating a huge pool of content to analyze for researchers. But why is it important for us to look at the propaganda and the silly memes that these Groypers produce? It's simple. We know next to nothing about the effect that TikTok and its algorithms can have on people, even less when considering its use by political actors. The body of literature on the topic is growing fast. We've had papers and studies in the last year which showed that, yes, far-right content is in fact present on TikTok, and that this content can go viral in spite of the numbers of followers the accounts spreading it actually have. meaning that small accounts can make content that is viewed by millions in any case. What we don't know yet is how far-right groups use TikTok in order to appeal to younger demographics that use it. What is their message, and how is it communicated? From those questions, I developed my research question, which is, how is white nationalism sold to Generation Z on TikTok? The next step of the process was to build a database. So I took to TikTok, made an account, and kind of gamed the algorithm until I could find the content that I was looking for by liking content that was, primordially right-wing. I ultimately fell on one Canadian page called Right Wingism TikTok, which identified itself as being one, Canadian through its bio, and two, a part of the Groyper movement through its AVI, or the profile picture, which was a picture of Nick Fuentes. At the time of deletion, because the page has now been deleted, there were 182 videos on the account, which totaled over 2,600,000 views. I took diligent notes on the content of those videos, looking at the different ways in which meaning can be carried over in a single TikTok, whether that's the footage, the text, the caption, as well as the sound that is used for the video. I then used Ruth Wodak's discourse historical method, which grounds discourse into 4 levels of context in order to properly deconstruct the meaning of the videos I analyzed. These 4 levels of context provide fulsome understanding of the politics, current events, as well as other discourses which influence a given discourse. In order to peel away the layers of irony and disingenuous discourse that we usually expect from those groups, I also used Tern Van Dish's denial of racism framework, which facilitates the deconstruction of speech that's intended to dissimulate racist thought. Post-analysis, 3 different narrative streams kind of stood out to me, each fitting a different objective sought after by the radical right. So shifting the Overton window, weaponizing the past, and calling for a right-wing revolution. These became kind of the body paragraphs of my paper. In this first stream, content that sought to expand the Overton window was lumped together. The Overton window is a concept developed by a libertarian thinker who wanted to envision a way to describe the scope of ideas that are deemed acceptable in society. The concept is pretty simple. There's a window of ideas which ultimately determines what ideas are deemed as centrist or reasonable, and what ideas are deemed as extreme and should be frowned upon. This window is movable, though moving it inevitably leads to some ideas becoming unacceptable as they fall out of the reasonable spectrum. So how are Canadian Groypers trying to shift this window? A lot of the content found on the account used humor as well as denial tactics in order to misrepresent or introduce harmful ideas without necessarily arousing the suspicion of the viewer. One video, for example, showed Groyper leader Nick Fuentes entering in a monologue and discussing how Muppet character Cookie Monster could cook 6 million cookies if he had 15 ovens in 4 different kitchens. He then says that the math doesn't quite add up, and that maybe a more realistic number would be 200 to 300,000 cookies. He then discusses whether cooking those cookies would produce smokestacks, whether there was enough room in the cookie storage holes around the kitchen in order to store all of those cookies, or whether the wooden ovens used were good enough to cook all of those cookies, as he concludes that the ovens would have been better for something like delousing. Of course, you'll recognize that all of these different points amount to a thinly veiled analogy for Holocaust denialism. But presenting these talking points under the guise of humor creates a sort of gray area which desensitizes the viewer, who might not fully understand the politics of the video. Another notable tactic used to shift the Overton window is to associate far-right opinions to celebrities. For example, there were a few videos in which violence against women was discussed in positive manners, meaning endorsing violence against women, particularly against women who are deemed to be promiscuous. These videos featured popular musicians like XXXTentacion, now deceased, but who faced a lot of criticism and legal charges throughout his life for acts of violence against women, some of them very, very violent. Content using this tactic also frequently mentioned or featured ex-Hockey Night in Canada star Don Cherry, particularly an interview conducted in the 90s in which he describes himself as a nationalist and rants about foreigners coming to Canada to earn the dough, ending his monologue by saying Canada first and Canada only. This call for Canada First, of course, is presented by Canadian groypers as an early endorsement of their ideology and their group. In either cases, though, we see a member of the movement associating aspects of their ideology to celebrities in order to make the content they make more palatable to a broader audience. A lot of the content found on the account also focused on the past in a variety of different ways. Firstly, there was a lot of content that idealized the past, showing viewers how great everything was before. Before what? That's never really defined. We see a lot of glorification of, for example, the British Dominion, as well as mentions of Canada's great achievements on the international front, particularly in international hockey. More insidiously, some of the content also sought to rewrite the past by denying or even endorsing and praising the horrors of colonization. In one video, the posters tell the viewers about the quote-unquote lies of slavery, asserting that the African and Arab slave trades were actually much worse than the Atlantic slave trade, and that on that basis, Europeans should be credited for ending slavery rather than scorned for partaking in it. The video ends with a stern warning. Don't let them say that your ancestors are nothing. Don't allow them to tell you that everything bad in society was caused by whites. So here we have an explicit attempt at whitewashing the past in order to defend our ancestors from an unnamed party who is seemingly attempting to ruin the memory of those ancestors on the basis that they were white. So here we see that the threat level towards our quote-unquote traditions, our cultures, our nations is ultimately perceived as a threat towards whiteness writ large. This element of threat is particularly important in elaborating calls for action, and is then used to present a return to tradition and a return to traditionalist regimes as the only way to protect your culture from this unnamed party, which almost inevitably comes through the promotion of fascist leaders and movements. We see that throughout the account, notably with content that praises the Francisco Franco regime in Spain, which we see mentioned through content which calls, for example, for the viewer to quote-unquote participate in the liberation of Barcelona. This is a reference to the conquest of Barcelona by the Phalangists during the Spanish Civil War, which was viewed as a turning point that ensured the fascist victory. These videos praising fascists long dead and gone are also presented along with videos which show groyper leaders taking up the mantle of defending traditionalism in the 21st century, as though they are pitching themselves as the fascist leaders of the future. In the context of COVID-19, for example, a lot of that content revolves around resisting mask mandates and presents kind of resisting those mandates as calling for a return to the past and to the way things was, as well as kind of an expression of avoiding consequences and a return to white male-centric power. The last narrative stream that came up in the content I found on the account is content that follows a very Gramscian structure, which emphasizes the central nature of culture and morality in the revolutionary fight for global hegemony. An overwhelming number of these videos found on the account describe a very specific enemy, known as the globalists. That's a term that all anti-hate researchers should know of by now. Depictions of these globalists almost unavoidably rest upon long-standing anti-Semitic tropes, which view Jews as cosmopolitan elites who care more about their tribe than the well-being of the countries in which they live. We see that vehiculated in other groups and movements, for example, QAnon, albeit in a more implicit manner. The groypers, though, take it a step further, as we can see in the content that they post, which explicitly states their belief that the globalists are in fact Jews. In one video, which co-opts a scene from the hit cartoon movie The Incredibles, Mr. Incredible, one of the main characters, is seen speaking to his boss, who's renamed Mr. Shapiro for the context of the video. Mr. Shapiro tells him that he needs to make better propaganda in order to quote-unquote help Israelis over the Goyim, undercut quote-unquote actual citizens with illegals, as well as create a racially mixed empire that the Jews can rule. The video ends with Mr. Incredible wearing a skull mask, really the symbol of white supremacy in the 21st century, and murdering his boss. The video, like many others, emphasizes the view that the globalist hegemon, depicted as Jewish, is immoral and interested in world domination over the well-being of the planet. Other pieces of content also blame Jews for the perceived moral decay of society, notably by alleging that Jews either invented or even promoting transgender identities, or that the globalist elites enjoy and engage in pedophilia. In one video, Nick Fuentes is seen commenting on a movie he believes to promote pedophilia, and says, "If this were happening in a normal town, people would get pitchforks and torches, and they would find these expletive people, and they would murder them. They would expletive murder them." Here, we see that the weaponization of common sense, which is crucial in the counter-hegemonic process described by Gramsci, because whoever holds moral control over common sense and reason is ultimately seen as the rightful hegemon. These posts are consumed in conjunction with other posts found on the account, which call for a diversity of tactics to reverse the globalist hegemony. That comes through voting, rioting, to all-out war. In that way, regardless of the order in which you come across their content, you almost unavoidably get this very Gramscian narrative thrown at you. To promote a sense of urgency, videos showing, for example, Black Lives Matter protesters, as well as in some cases riots, are shown throughout the account. One of these videos very transparently says, "Restore order, vote right wing." Other videos call for young white men to even declare war on quote-unquote those who call them racists and potential Timothy McVeighs. So what does all of this teach us? First, it further validates the idea that the far right has once again proved to be very fast at adapting to new technologies and at using crises in order to grow its ranks. This is a story we've seen play out time and time again. As we'll remember, neo-Nazis were among the first to adopt the internet as a platform for hate, as they did in the early 90s when the forum Stormfront was established as a bulletin board. Second, it tells us that the far right is actively trying to radicalize Generation Z already, using different tactics and rebranding schemes in order to do so. Rather than using extreme aesthetics as well as the appeal of camaraderie, as we see with a lot of skinhead groups, for example, new mediums like TikTok, but also video game streaming, are now used by groups like the Groypers. We're still targeting pastimes and hobbies, but this time you don't even need to leave the house in order to engage in it. All of this also teaches us that it's possible to build very extensive narratives and propaganda campaigns, even in contexts where you don't really control the order in which different messages are shown. A single TikTok video, just like a single meme, can contain large amounts of information and meaning, and often pushes people to do their own research. This is particularly problematic when you consider that TikTok promotes virality over who you follow in terms of deciding what goes into your feed, meaning that one video that calls for something somewhat extreme can make it into a lot of feeds and push users to ask questions and perhaps even research far-right materials. Lastly, we see that even if the far right is adopting new technologies, their message remains broadly the same and continues to lean on age-old tropes associated to Nazism, of course, but 2,000 years really of anti-Semitism and bigotry. From all of this, we also get new questions. The one that I would like to leave you with is this one. How can we measure the effects of asynchronous narratives, such as the one found into the TikTok feeds of right-wing accounts on young people? Thank you for your time, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the symposium.